Molag Bal wanted my mind, Boethia wanted my arms, and Nocturnal perhaps my curiosity. Azura wants all of that, and our love above all. Not our abject slavering, but our honest and genuine caring in all its forms. It is important to her that our emotions be engaged in her worship, and our love must also be directed inward. If we love her and hate ourselves, she feels our pain. I will, for all time, have no other mistress. In his book Invocation of Azura, Sigilla Parade talks about Azura's obsessive desire for love with these words. What really caught my attention, and the reason I wanted to make this video, is exactly what lies in those sentences about Azura, the Spirit Queen, Mother of the Rose, or as she's also called, the Queen of Twilight. This Daedric prince, hungry for love, above all else demands the love of her followers. But it's not just a simple wish. She wants them to love only her. And if her worshippers fail to do that, it's said that Azura suffers. This obsessive need for love has earned her an incredibly loyal following. In this video, we'll dive into Azura, one of the most fascinating Daedric princes in the vast Elder Scrolls pantheon, and take a look at the paradoxes she creates. I chose Azura because she's such a great character. Being a Daedra, you might easily fall into the mistake of thinking she's just evil, but once you learn her story, that idea might change. Sometimes she's a compassionate guide, but other times she's a divine being responsible for immense suffering. And it's exactly this duality at the heart of her nature that makes her such an interesting subject, for this video and for me personally. The Prince of Dawn and Dusk, Azura embodies both the beautiful and the dangerous sides of life within her very being. Her obsession with love is so dangerous that after the death of her beloved champion, Indoril Nerevar, whose name this channel also carries, Azura's grief and anger led her to curse an entire race. That's one of the most powerful examples of just how extreme her relationship with love and being loved can get. Azura values loyalty above all else. If you love her and follow her will, she's very likely to reward you. But if you do all that and then end up disappointing her in the end, Azura turns into the worst kind of crazy ex you've ever met. If you get tangled up in her love and then one day betray her thinking you can escape, Azura never forgets, and she will destroy you. Her rage and wrath are just as extreme as the madness of her love. Throughout this video, we'll explore who Azura is and look at examples of this. One last note, I love Azura. In every Elder Scrolls game I've played, my path has always crossed with hers. I guess I'm a little obsessed with love and being loved myself. That's why I personally count her among the good Daedra. So in this video, I'll be approaching things with a bit of that bias. And, of course, I'd love to hear your own thoughts about Azura. Any stories or details I didn't mention. Enjoy the video. Queen of Dawn and Dusk. Azura is one of the most well-known and influential Daedric princes in the Elder Scrolls universe. Her impact on Tamriel shapes the main storyline of the series' third game, Morrowind. Alongside Mehrunes Dagon, Molag Bal, and even Akatosh, she's one of the very few Daedric princes directly tied to a main Elder Scrolls story. Azura is known by many names, and each of those names usually symbolizes one of her spheres of influence. The diversity of these aspects at the core of her being is what makes her such a fascinating Daedra. Understanding them gives us a foundation to make sense of Azura's complex nature. That's why in this section, we'll focus on who Azura really is. First and foremost, Azura is often associated with Dawn and Dusk, a connection we hear about constantly in the games. The magic of Twilight, the transition between night and day, is her very essence. She also governs spheres like mystery, magic, fate, prophecy, pride, and even egoism. As you probably know, the concept of spheres represents the essence and foundation of every Daedric prince. I actually covered this concept in detail in my video, The History of Daedric Invasions, so if you'd like to dive deeper, don't forget to check that one out. As we get to know Azura better, you'll see how all these concepts truly fit her. Let's start with the idea of transition, symbolized by the shift between night and day. This idea is at the very core of her identity. Azura is often called the Prince of Transitions, ruling over the state of change between two things, or the boundary between here and there. But this interpretation goes far beyond simple shifts in time. Azura stands as a fundamental force that sparks and governs deep changes in existence, reality, and fate itself. When she's described as a liminal god, meaning one who exists in between at the threshold, it suggests she holds sway over the boundaries of existence. I know Elder Scrolls theology can get confusing pretty quickly, but to put it more simply, all this talk of transition connects directly to Azura's link with prophecy and fate. She doesn't just see the future, she actively guides the transitions that lead to prophecy. and to understand the Nerevarine prophecy, which we'll get into later, you need to first grasp this side of Azura. Now, these traits might make it sound like Azura has total control over destiny, but that's not exactly the case. What she does is glimpse hints of future events, attempt to manipulate fate itself, and make prophecies based on those glimpses. In other words, Azura doesn't create the future ahead of time. She studies the signs, pulls the strings, and nudges events toward the outcome she envisions. She's the one who brought about the Nerevarine prophecy and chose the mortals she deemed worthy to walk that path, saving Vvardenfell from both the Tribunal and Dagoth-Ur. This is why Azura stands out compared to many other Daedric princes when it comes to directly interfering with Tamriel. Think about it. The Nerevarine prophecy is something Azura kept alive for over 2,000 years. Of course, we also have to remember that mortals and Daedric princes perceive time very differently. I'll go into more detail on that later in the video. Earlier, I mentioned that Azura is also associated with pride. Pride is an important, yet often overlooked part of her character. Sated pride is benevolent, but hungry pride is cruel. This phrase sums it up perfectly. Azura's kindness depends on receiving the admiration she craves. If she senses even a hint of disrespect, neglect, or lack of devotion from her followers, her hungry pride is triggered, and her merciless, destructive side comes out. This shows the conditional nature at the core of her actions. The state of her pride determines her moral stance in any given interaction. Now, some may call Azura hypocritical, but if you had to worship a Daedra, I'd still say she's your best option. She's the only Daedric prince who truly loves her followers. She cares for all her family and wants what she believes is best for them. The problem is, if you don't agree with her definition of best, then you're in serious trouble. Still, we can't ignore the fact that Azura is one of the few Daedric princes who can be described as benevolent. In Oblivion, her name is spoken freely by much of the population, showing that she's generally accepted among the people of Cyrodiil. The legendary Azura statue in Skyrim also proves that she's at least somewhat respected, even in the harsh lands of the Nords. But can you truly trust Azura? Absolutely not. At the end of the day, she's still a Daedric prince. And when you consider that the Daedric understanding of morality, of good and evil, is so completely different from ours, everything about her remains mysterious and impossible to fully understand. Finally, Azura's title as the Queen of the Night Sky comes from her control over the movements of the moons. This shows us that her influence extends not only over time, but also over the very fabric of space and existence itself. And this is directly tied to why Azura holds such an immense importance for the Khajiit. We'll go into that in more detail later in the section on Azura's worship. Azura has always been seen as a protector of the people, a light in the darkness, by both the Dunmer and the Khajiit, and she's been respected by many across Tamriel. She often used her knowledge of prophecy and fate to guide the champions who devoted themselves to her. It's said that she created the Khajiit from the earth itself, and that she guided the Dunmer in building their own culture. Azura doesn't really care who her followers are, she doesn't discriminate. But at the same time, it's also said that she destroyed an entire race for going against her. Of course, none of Azura's cruel actions ever come from boredom or for no reason. There are always motives behind them, motives we might even call logical. Pride, jealousy, love, and vanity. The harmony of all these traits is what truly sets Azura apart from the rest. Moonshadow. In my earlier videos, I mentioned how every Daedric prince in the Elder Scrolls universe has their own plane of oblivion. Azura's realm, Moonshadow, is described as a breathtakingly beautiful place. It's filled with waterfalls, vibrant flowers, stunning forests, and even a silver city. The air itself is perfumed and rain falls often. Moonshadow is described as a twilight island made of shadows and half-thoughts. Its beauty is so overwhelming that it can either blind mortal eyes or blur their vision. The realm is in a constant state of twilight, completely lacking the normal cycle of day and night. Azura herself resides in a palace made of roses, which is where her title, Lady of the Roses, comes from. The way Moonshadow is portrayed perfectly supports Azura's role as the Prince of Prophecy and Fate. To mortals, this realm is almost impossible to fully grasp, and that difficulty mirrors the overwhelming, elusive nature of truth and destiny. Considering how Azura often gives cryptic guidance instead of clear answers, the nature of Moonshadow reflects that side of her perfectly. By deliberately blurring the straightforward cycles of day and night, Moonshadow becomes a realm of uncertainty, a place where Azura sends mortals to interpret their own prophecies and choose their own path. Azura's influence on Tamriel. Azura's influence across Tamriel is wide and varied, showing up in different ways among different cultures and races. But in the end, all these differences come together in the same being. And it's this layered, philosophical nature of her influence that makes Azura such a fascinating Daedric prince. Because Azura is such a visible figure among the Daedra, her name comes up often in Tamriel. Even in societies with strong anti-Daedra sentiments, like the lands of the Empire where Daedra worship is outlawed, you'll still find her name mentioned frequently. This isn't necessarily out of deep reverence, but it shows just how well known she is. If you remember from Skyrim, guards openly admire Azura's star, calling it legendary. That tells us that Azura's name holds a place not just in religious devotion, but also culturally among the people. Her worship is even tolerated to some extent in imperial territories like High Rock, where there are Azura monasteries near major cities such as Wayrest. Compared to other Daedric cults, that level of acceptance is truly unique. And think about it, doesn't Azura's widespread recognition show just how deeply her power and presence have become woven into Tamriel's cultural fabric? I think it absolutely does. And the fact that this isn't tied to deep religious devotion, but rather to cultural acceptance, that's a huge achievement in Azura's name. The Mother of the Rose in Khajiit culture. In Khajiit culture, Azura is known as Azura, and among the cat folk of elsewhere, she's worshipped with deep devotion as their highest and most important deity. Unlike most other races, though maybe with the Dunmer as an exception, the Khajiit openly revere her. You see, the Khajiit don't draw such a sharp line between Daedra and Daedra the way human races do. That's why they focus on Azura's benevolent side and worship her as a guiding figure. This also shows us how diverse Azura's influence really is across Tamriel. For some peoples, she represents a cultural symbol, but for the Khajiit, she holds an existential meaning. So where does this existential meaning come from? In Khajiiti theology, Azura is seen as the mother of all Khajiit and their creator goddess. She shaped the raw clay into lasting forms, giving birth to the Khajiit race. Some sources tell the story differently. In some, Azura reshaped the Bosmer into Khajiit and bound them to the lunar lattice. In Altmer mythology, though, the belief is that the Khajiit descended from the High Elves, which also conveniently supports the ideology of the Aldmeri Dominion. Which of these stories is actually true? We'll never know for certain, thanks to the deliberately ambiguous storytelling of the Elder Scrolls. But what's undeniable is Azura's central role in Khajiit culture. It's said that Azura knows the names of every Khajiit who will ever live, and that worshipping her is the very first step on the Khajiit's path to salvation. So what exactly is this path of Azura? It's called the Twilight Path, a journey toward love and salvation. According to the Khajiit, Azura watches over the gates of the lunar lattice, the twilight realm that separates the mortal world from the afterlife. Through their devotion to her, Khajiit souls are guided across the lunar lattice to a paradise they call the Sands Behind the Stars. For the Khajiit then, Azura is not just a goddess. They see her as the divine being who personally guides them into an eternal paradise where they will find everlasting joy. From all of this, we can conclude that the Khajiit's relationship with Azura is overwhelmingly benevolent, completely unlike the experience of the Dunmer. For the Khajiit, Azura is a nurturing mother and a guiding figure who leads them to the afterlife, to paradise. This sharp contrast reveals that the nature of Azura's actions is conditional, heavily influenced by perceived loyalty, obedience, and dedication to the path she sets. What I mean is this: by constantly showing respect, loving her, and following the path, the Khajiit managed to avoid the hungry pride and wrath that the Dunmer experienced through the Tribunal. For the Dunmer race, we can't say the same. And this once again proves that Azura's obsessive love isn't inherently destructive. It isn't tied to random bursts of anger. Instead, the way it manifests is directly dependent on the behavior of her followers. I'll end Azura's place in Khajiiti culture here because it's impossible to cover all of Azura's stories in Khajiit theology within a single video. Maybe one day I'll make a dedicated video just about that. But for this video, I want to focus on Azura's obsessive love and jealousy, and the best examples of that can be found in Dunmer culture. So I've kept the Khajiit-Azura relationship as a summary. Now, let's move on to the main section: how Azura is positioned in Dunmer culture. Dunmer and Azura, a relationship bound by fate. The relationship between Azura and the Dunmer is one of betrayal, punishment, and redemption, and it stands as one of the most defining cases of a Daedra directly interfering with mortal history in all of Tamriel. One of the most important moments in Dunmer history was when the golden-skinned Chimer transformed into the ash-skinned, fire-eyed Dunmer. This dramatic change is most often seen as the result of Azura's curse. She cast it in response to the Tribunal's betrayal of her champion, Indoril Nerevar, and their breaking of their oath not to use the Heart of Lorkhan. Of course, depending on who you ask, this curse can also be seen as a blessing. As you know, some elves living in Somerset began to notice the corruption within Altmer society and chose to distance themselves from the majority. These elves came to be known as the Chimer. Over time, as their religious differences grew, the pressure on the Chimer increased. Daedric Princes Boethia and Mephala revealed to them the lies the Daedra had spread about Lorkhan and opened the path for their exodus. Under the leadership of Saint Veloth, the Chimer began their great migration out of the Somerset Isles. They eventually split into 3 groups, following Boethia, Mephala, and Azura. Those who followed Azura traveled east to the land of Morrowind, guided by her light. It's believed that Azura taught the Chimer how to distinguish themselves from the Altmer, and she warned them against the corrupting influences of Daedric princes like Molag Bal in order to preserve the purity of their people. Chimer legends also say that Lord Indoril Nerevar was Azura's champion, and that the two shared a special bond. Nerevar often sought Azura's counsel on important matters. The ring known as Moon and Star was blessed by Azura for Nerevar, and it was said that anyone other than him who wore it would die. This ring gave Nerevar incredible persuasive power and played a major role in his rise as the leader of the Chimer people. When the Chimer arrived in Morrowind, they encountered the Dwemer race. The Nord invasions from the north forced the Chimer and Dwemer into an alliance, which brought about 3 centuries of peace. But in the end, the Dwemer discovered the heart of Lorkhan deep within Red Mountain and sought to harness its divine power. Nerevar, however, saw this as blasphemy against the very values the Chimer believed in. This disagreement eventually led to the War of the Red Mountain. According to the Tribunal's version of events, Indoril Nerevar, with the help of Azura and the Tribunal members, used the heart of Lorkhan to destroy the entire Dwemer race. The Dwemer did indeed vanish, but whether it was because of their meddling with the heart or the combined efforts of Azura and Nerevar, we'll never know for sure. After the war, and following the sudden disappearance of the Dwemer, Indoril Nerevar gathered his closest companions, Almalexia, Sothasil, and Vivec, and made them swear in Azura's presence and in her name never to use the heart of Lorkhan. The Tribunal members took the oath, but only a few years later they broke their vow to Nerevar. They tapped into the heart's divine power and proclaimed themselves the living gods of the Dunmer. And indeed, through the heart of Lorkhan, the Tribunal gained godlike power. Thus, the Tribunal as we know it was born. Azura then appeared in great anger and cursed the Tribunal members. She prophesied that her champion, and most likely her beloved Nerevar, would one day return to punish them for their betrayal, ensuring that such blasphemous knowledge could never again be used to mock or challenge the will of the gods. But Azura didn't stop there. As punishment, she transformed the entire golden-skinned Chimer race into the ash-skinned, red-eyed Dunmer, cursing them forever. And as for the prophecy of Nerevar's reincarnation, Azura gave no time frame. That uncertainty tormented the Tribunal for 2,000 years. Now that we know the story, let's talk about what it really means. The so-called curse might not have been just a physical change. First and foremost, it can be read as an act directed against the Tribunal themselves. Maybe Azura wanted these 3 Chimer, who dared to see themselves as gods, to be reminded of their sins and guilt every time they looked into the faces of their people, with no escape. At the same time, this act was Azura's way of claiming the Dunmer as her own, separating them clearly and permanently from the Altmer. This is also why some stories interpret it not as a curse, but as Azura's blessing. Perhaps Azura imprinted her own physical essence onto the Dunmer, severing them from the Tribunal forever. And consider this, Vivec was only half affected by the curse, Almalexia not at all. Sothasil, although he could have resisted it, chose to accept the new Dunmer form of his own free will, and he was even content with it. So don't think of Azura's act of reshaping an entire race as just a simple reaction born out of anger. It was a pure display of her ability for long-term strategic thinking, of weaving her vengeance directly into the fabric of a people's identity. The fact that Azura herself is often depicted with Dunmer-like features suggests a deep, possessive bond with them. Their transformed appearance wasn't just a mark of shame, it was also a sign of their ultimate protector. In this way, we see another layer of her obsessive love, the urge to possess and control her people. At first, the Chimer were terrified by this transformation, but later, when Sothasil reframed it as a blessing and called them the new Mir, the people began to accept it more easily. Still, there was another side to this change. Beyond the physical appearance, it also implied that the Dunmer would suffer under fate's harsh hand, that their destiny itself was marked by hardship. Considering Azura's connection with fate, it seems fitting that she punished her people this way for turning toward the Tribunal. And indeed, the Dunmer's life after this was anything but easy. No matter how hard their Tribunal gods tried to protect them, invasions, disasters, and wars would always haunt the Dunmer. Azura and the Tribunal, Betrayal, Vengeance, and Legacy. The relationship between the Tribunal and Azura is a story of betrayal and vengeance that spans millennia, and it's one of my favorite storylines in all of Elder Scrolls. In the last section, I talked about Indoril Nerevar and how important he was to Azura. Nerevar was a leader who carried out Azura's will among the Chimer. He was loved and deeply respected by his people, but his death sparked one of the greatest struggles for vengeance in Tamriel's history, the story of Azura's break with the Tribunal. After the War of the Red Mountain, Azura gave one clear command: do not use the heart. Nerevar warned his 3 generals and made them swear an oath. This oath was crucial because Azura was firmly against the rise of any new gods, whether Dwemer or Chimer, and the heart of Lorkhan had the power to make that happen. But driven by ambition and the desire to achieve greatness, the Tribunal broke that sacred oath and seized the divine power for themselves. By doing so, they stole the place once held by the good Daedra, Buthia, Mephala, and Azura, who had been the foundation of Chimer worship. From then on, the Dunmer had new living gods. So what happened to Nerevar during all of this? Azura's champion was dead, and there are 2 major accounts of his death. The first is the Tribunal's own version. Nerevar was wounded in battle against Dagoth-Ur and eventually died from his injuries. Just before his death, it's said that he made the Tribunal swear never to use the heart. This account also conveniently avoids tying the Tribunal's godhood directly to the heart of Lorkhan, since they don't admit to drawing their power from it. The opposing account, and the one I personally believe, which also aligns with Azura's version, is that Nerevar was killed by the Tribunal themselves. Most likely, they poisoned him while he was already wounded. In fact, Vivek's own 36th sermon contains what many interpret as a confession of this assassination, through the hidden acrostic message, foul murder. Azura believed this murder had taken place, and in response she delivered a prophecy that would one day end the Tribunal's godhood, the Nerevarine prophecy. Knowing the extent of Azura's power and her influence over fate, the Tribunal lived in fear of this prophecy for 2,000 years. In the Elder Scrolls Online, when Vivek begins to lose his power for mysterious reasons, his very first fear is that the Nerevarine prophecy is finally coming true. The same fear haunted Almalexia. Sotha-Sil, however, always knew that he would one day lose his divinity and die, because, as I'll explain later, he shared certain parallels with Azura. That's the kind of centuries-long fear Azura planted in the hearts of the so-called living gods. For over a millennium, Azura worked to take her revenge and re-establish her divine authority. That might sound like an impossibly long time to us, but as I've said before, time flows very differently for the Daedra, and this is exactly what terrified the Tribunal. In those 2,000 years, the Chimer Curse, the Nerevarine Prophecy, and the Red Year all came to pass. Each of them, directly or indirectly, was tied to Azura and represented the consequences of the Tribunal's betrayal. The Nerevarine Prophecy ultimately brought down the Tribunal and stripped them of their godhood. Almalexia killed Sotha-Sil, only to be slain later by the Nerevarine. Vivek, severed from the heart of Lorkhan, disappeared. His disappearance caused Bardau, the moon he held aloft with his power, to fall, triggering the eruption of Red Mountain. The eruption devastated all of Vardenfell and left Vivek City in ruins, uninhabitable. Morrowind lost its political stability and fell into an age of hardship. But in the end, the Dunmer abandoned their worship of the Tribunal and returned to their old traditions, once again devoting themselves to the 3 good Daedra, Azura, Mephala, and Boethia. The religious history of the Dunmer can be summed up as a clear cycle. Their first devotion to Azura, betrayal for the Tribunal, the Curse, then suffering through the Red Year, and finally returning to Azura as the Reclamations. In this cycle, we can't ignore Azura's incredible patience, or her ultimate success in reclaiming her followers. The Tribunal's false gods held such high status in Tamriel for so long that many Dunmer probably never imagined they would worship Azura again. And yet, as Zurin Arctus once said, each event is preceded by prophecy, but without the hero, there is no event. All of this highlights Azura's deep strategic foresight and her ability to manipulate fate over vast stretches of time. It's also a perfect example of how her obsession with being loved can transform into a wrath that lasts for millennia. This is the nature of Azura, goddess of prophecy and fate. Her anger isn't a fleeting emotion, it's the driving force behind a long-term, carefully calculated vengeance. The nature of worshipping Azura. Worship of Azura in Tamriel is a unique experience, very different from the worship of most other Daedric princes. It's defined by deep personal devotion and mutual expectations. To truly follow her requires emotional involvement. Let me explain. Her followers must show not only love for Azura, but also genuine love for themselves. She forms a mutual bond with her worshippers. If they hate themselves, Azura feels their pain and sheds tears. But if they love themselves and dedicate that love to her, Azura's pride is fed and she responds with benevolence. As we've already seen, the opposite leads to cruelty and vengeance. Azura's love is powerful, but it's conditional, and she uses it as a tool to sustain her strength as a Daedric prince. Another aspect of Azura that I find fascinating is that she doesn't demand slavish begging from her followers. Instead, she expects sincere and genuine love. This sets her apart from many other Daedric princes who enslave their worshippers. Azura encourages individuals to seek their own purposes, while offering subtle divine guidance along the way. Of course, she also expects her sharp commandments to be obeyed without question. Like her prohibition on using the Heart of Lorkhan, her followers are known as Azurites. Those who pledge themselves to her fully are honored with fiery sapphire blue eyes. On occasion, Azura can even influence Tamriel directly by inhabiting the body of one of her followers, a phenomenon we see multiple times in the Elder Scrolls Online. Azura and moral dilemmas. Now we can finally talk about whether Azura is truly good or evil, and take a more moral perspective on her obsessive love. From the very beginning of this video, I've said that this obsession is a core part of her character, and the driving force behind her actions. So let's ask, how can this deep possessiveness and demand for unconditional loyalty actually affect someone in Tamriel? Since Azura describes herself as a lady, and throughout the Elder Scrolls series almost always chooses to appear in female form, I'd say she resembles a deeply jealous woman. Her pride fuels that jealousy, turning her into someone who is constantly starved for love, and dangerous because of it. At times, that jealousy turns into spite. All of these stories reflect her nature, an obsession with worship and being loved. Azura demands absolute, unshakable loyalty. She can become overwhelmingly possessive of you. And sure, at first you might think that works in your favor. But what happens if you slip up? Because once that loyalty is broken, her motherly affection can instantly twist into a disproportionate, terrifying, uncontrollable force, and suddenly you're part of a grand tale of vengeance. Think back to the quest at Azura's shrine in Oblivion. We're asked to kill a group of former Azura worshippers who had turned into vampires. Through us, Azura wipes out every one of them for straying from her path and falling into Moloch balls. Or look at Malyn Varen, who corrupted Azura's star. He was once a priest of Azura, and yet we as the player end up destroying him because of his mistakes in worship. And in Skyrim, when we solve a problem that had been troubling Azura, we see her abandon her own priestess afterwards, simply because the woman was no longer useful to her. This last example in particular makes Azura's relationship with her followers even more complicated. So, is Azura truly a guide to her followers, or is she just manipulating them? That's an important question. Historically, her guidance toward her worshippers often looks benevolent. But the real question is, was she pushing mortals toward their destiny or toward the destiny she wanted for them? The answer depends on how you see it, and whether you consider her a benevolent or a selfish deity. Like many things in the Elder Scrolls, it's hard to classify Azura as simply good or evil. But I can put her into clearer terms by looking at her dualities. Azura is selfish because her followers often declare things like, "The only Daedric prince I worship is Azura." She can't stand the idea of her worshippers dividing their love with another god. Azura is almost trustworthy because she guided the Chimer to new lands and through the Nerevarine prophecy brought about the downfall of Dagoth-Ur and the Tribunal. Her prophecies don't deceive. Azura is vengeful and spiteful because she cannot bear being disappointed. And I've already explained how long she can patiently wait for her revenge. Azura is forgiving because despite an entire people turning away from her to worship false gods, she punished them in a way that could be seen as merciful, and eventually accepted them back. And even though her kindness is conditional, let me ask you this. How many of us do good completely without expecting anything in return? That's a fundamental philosophical question about human nature itself. What's fascinating about Azura is the paradox of her love. It can be the source of great blessing or of devastating wrath. Judging the actions of a Daedra through our own standards of good and evil is already difficult. But with Azura, it becomes even more complex. And that's exactly what makes her such an intriguing deity. And with that, we've reached the end of our video about Azura. I hope I was able to give you a different perspective on the Daedric Prince of Dawn and Dusk. I've tried to show you as many of the dualities at the heart of her existence as I could, the nature of someone who stands in between, who embodies transition itself. Azura has always fascinated me because she can appear both as a benevolent mother figure and as a vengeful punisher. Add to that her love, something we can only describe as obsessive and dangerous, and she becomes one of the most complex characters to truly understand. Personally, I think Azura is one of the Daedra with the greatest storytelling potential in the entire Elder Scrolls universe. Her deep, lasting influence has stretched across millennia and shaped nearly every civilization. From defining the origins of races like the Dunmer and Khajiit, to playing a central role in events like the War of the Red Mountain and the devastating Red Year, Azura's presence is intricately woven into the history, culture, and fate of Tamriel. Her story offers us a lens to better understand both the complexity of divine power and the dangerous relationships between mortals and gods, and I truly believe Azura will continue to be a force of change and transformation in the Elder Scrolls 6 and beyond, always guiding her followers toward the destiny she envisions for them, no matter the cost. Before we close, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you like Azura as a character? How do you approach her in your Elder Scrolls playthroughs? And would you describe her as good or evil? Don't forget to share your ideas and leave a like on the video. I'm planning a full series on the Tribunal in the future, so I'll see you in that one.